On today's episode of the Leadmore Podcast, we are talking about podcast. That's right. So we are talking about podcast on a podcast because I believe that the podcast is one of the best things for a leader, a CEO to create. Now, why is that? Well, first of all, I think it's a really good way for a leader to test their ideas, to practice, to engage in conversation, to interview, all good skills of a leader. Secondly, as a marketer, if you're growing a business or trying to create some sort of influence or reach, the podcast is the best way, I say, to put content in and to create content out. What do I mean by that? Well, you create a video podcast and you get reels and clips for social media. You can turn it into a blog post. You can write an ebook. You can even write a book after recording hundreds of podcasts. And so you can see how it's the best sort of pyramid of content, I like to say. You create a podcast and you can create so much more content off of that podcast. Why do you think that the Leadmore Podcast is now in video? Bingo, exactly because of that. But now thirdly, this is more my bold statement, I think every company should have a podcast. That's right, every company. And I know the Onion article says, 300,000 podcasts in America are looking for guests this week. The Onion, of course, is always accurate. But the tongue-in-cheek humor, despite the world thinking that we don't need another podcast, I think every company should have a podcast because you can create that content. Like I said, a leader can practice their message and their ideas. But also, think about this. What about an internal podcast? Imagine you're starting a new job in January of 2024. And, on the first week, you get to do some training, some onboarding, work sidecar next to somebody. But then they go and take a meeting or they have to do other stuff. They have to do their job too, right? And then you can plug in your headphones and listen to a podcast. Maybe it's a 5-episode short mini series where the first episode is about the origin of the company. And the second episode is the CEO talking about the core values and what the company stands for and believes. And the third episode might be the HR director walking through the handbook and explaining the different benefits and the different things that you need to know about working there. Imagine how powerful that would be. You record it once, can live forever. Sure, you can make tweaks and updates and edits, but this piece of content exists and can be used over and over again. So I believe in podcast. I love it. I missed doing my podcast. That's why I brought it back. But I also believe it's a key part of growing my business. So when we're going to talk about podcast, who better to bring back onto the show than the producer of the Leadmore Podcast, my friend, Nate Poeppel. If you remember, Nate was on the show, I think it was November of 2021. So it's been a long time, episode 76. And at that time, Nate was just selling all of his physical possessions. He bought a van and he went off to go on van life. He started van life and traveled across America. He ended up settling now in Arizona and also since then has started his own company, Earthtones. And Earthtones helps, what do you guess? Leaders and businesses create podcasts. So in the spirit of the new format of Leadmore, where I want to take an idea or a framework or a model or a lesson or a tip, extract that out of a brain of some smart leader so that you, the leader, can take that and run with it and use it. And that's what we do in this episode of the Leadmore Podcast. So just like the Leadmore Podcast has always said, the world needs more leaders. And I still believe that if you're listening to this, you are a leader and it's your time to lead. But now I'm hoping to also give you the tools to equip you to be the leader. So with that, I'm your host, John T. Meyer. And on this episode of the Leadmore Podcast with Nate Poeppel, we're talking about podcast. So let's get right into it. I guess we're calling this like the 5 rules of podcasting, or I will have to give this a name, but you gave me 5 really good sort of pillars, we'll say, of if someone's thinking about building a podcast. If a leader says, we need a podcast, I want a podcast. So you hit on that word just now. The first one is know what story you want to tell. What are you trying to say? So tell us about that.
Yeah. So the real question is like, what are you trying to say? Are you trying to tell the story behind the business? Are you trying to educate people based on services that you offer? Are you telling the story of your life? Are you telling the story of other people's lives? I think for a lot of these business podcasts, like I've been working on, it's kind of a combination of all of those. I think that's how you maybe dive into the deepest things, because really it's all about like the human relation at the end of the day, and people who are going to be your customers are going to be seen it from the human experience, what they're going through and how like this is going to affect their life. I have another note here. I'm just kind of going off of what I wrote down, and I
Yeah.
put educate and entertain. I think there's like a good spectrum of like, what are you doing? Are you educating? Are you entertaining? And like, where are you on that scale? Because
Do you think you can be one or the other, or do you have to do both?
I think at some level, people are listening to a podcast to educate themselves, right? No matter what, you're always going to educate yourself if you're taking in someone's perspective that's different than your own, which is going to be every single person, right? So if you're showing up, at the end of the day, you are educating yourself. I don't think it needs to be hard into education or hard into entertainment. I think there's kind of a balance between the two, and some are going to be more funny.
Yeah, if I think about my sort of Rolodex of podcasts that I listen to, they serve different purposes, and sometimes it's different moods. If I'm going for a run, I want something just to entertain. If I'm maybe like kind of in the zone or on an airplane, I might want to learn more or educate. So yeah, I can resonate with that.
A really good example of this was the Event Company was actually probably one of the first video podcasts to happen in South Dakota. That
Yeah.
was the first project that I did that was like that. We did, I don't know how many episodes, probably like 80. She kind of like did this flip where it was kind of like an industry tech episode. So they would talk about, techniques of like their craft and like how to help other people in their own little planning. And then the next episode would be more so like talking to a guest and getting to know their story. And the podcast was called The Good Work, and it was about them doing good in the community, basically. But I liked that. They kind of had these two different topics that they were passionate about. And I think it kept it fresh too. It keeps it fresh for the audience. And there was some consistency with that kind of back and forth thing.
Yeah, that's such a good example of here's an event company called the Event Company. I mean, they help their event planners, and you might say, why do they have a podcast? But I thought it was great, right? Like I was a guest, and that's how I met you.
Yep.
But also like I got to share some ideas and tell stories. I was not a client, but then they had clients, and they got to feature some of their really successful clients. And so when you talk about building a podcast that may not make you money or like be on the iTunes top charts, I guarantee that gave their clients like a good feeling. People maybe wanted to work with them again, or other people saw that and said, "Oh, they work with them. Like we should work with them too."
Mm.
And so, like downstream, I think podcasts definitely can make you money. It just may not be as directly as like an ad or selling a product.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so many times like that. The First National Bank Common Sense on the Prairie podcast, that's another one I do. And I was talking to Adam, the host. Adam and I became good friends over the years, and he said that it's really helped them having a podcast and helping with their sales funnel, and also just helping them as an organization getting like straight on like what they're doing, like what their purpose is. And he said a lot of people come to them now, and it just makes it easy to sell because they are aware of who they are, what they believe in. And yeah, it makes sense, right? We're talking about a product where people are trusting their entire savings with you to make proper decisions. And if you can make them comfortable before that decision through something like a podcast, that's really powerful.
And I can say without disclosing too much, because I was on a marketing advisory council for the bank, but I've heard that podcast has paid for itself for like 80 years into the future.
Yep.
And so, to your point, it built trust, it built relationships, and I think it's been wildly profitable. All right. So know what story you want to tell. Why are you creating a podcast? What do you have to say?
Yep.
Think about, am I more educate? Am I more entertain? Secondly, if you're the host, if you're listening, you're probably the host or want to be the host, be prepared and be engaged. Tell us about that.
Like any conversation, it's really important to live in the present moment, to be in the moment, to not be thinking about the future, not be thinking about the past, be there with the guest. And I think that comes in a lot of ways. And I know there are a lot of, psychological reasonings why people fall out of that too. But I think it's important to be playful, to have elements of laughter, to have personality, to not take it too seriously. You've always been really good at doing this. I have way less experience doing anything like this, but would you say that it's been a hard process getting comfortable in this space? Or like, do you remember kind of the beginning stages? Because a lot of people who are going to podcast for the first time have maybe not ever done anything like this before. So it's a very vulnerable position where you're worried about the judgment of others and like what you're going to create, right?
Yeah, I would say being in front of a microphone or creating content or putting myself out there has never been hard for me. So that part, I don't really worry about that. I often got the feedback after episodes, or I took this as a compliment. People would say, "Oh, that went by really quickly." Like it just felt like it was a fast conversation, or it just felt like we were talking. But where I wasn't great, and I think I'm still working on it, to be honest, my wife tells me this when she listens, is you try so hard to make it feel like a conversation, but you also have to remember you are recording it. And so I would do things like, yeah, oh, like you
Filler
would if I
stuff.
were having coffee or something. And that's not really good, like experience for the listener. And so it's like, yes, I took it as the goal of just feeling like we're having a coffee or drinking over chatting over a couple beers. But also realizing that you're creating content. And I think you're right about being not only prepared, but also engaged. Like I think laughing when there's a joke. And one of the things I'm trying to learn as a guest on other people's podcasts is how do you speak in like little sound bites or little nuggets of phrases or words that are memorable, because as we get to the future ones, those things become really great pieces of micro content and nuggets that stick out. People remember that, right? When you can speak in those little blips.
For sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
Number 3, we have, this one's important. This is where you really helped me out. Get the most out of your audio and video setup. And I thought you wrote this well, which is not like have Hollywood style production, but get the most out of what you have. So tell us what that means.
My process of this is assessing your needs and then training you on that. And when I assess those needs, I'm also considering things that are versatile for you, right? Like right now, you have this podcast setup that looks great, sounds great, functions for this video call kind of thing. And good news, that's going to work for your Zoom calls. That's going to work for, your marketing content. You can do, I don't know, weekly little updates through it. So I want things that are versatile for people. And I also take into consideration how portable equipment needs to be. Like, are you traveling a lot? I'm going to recommend stuff that fits in your suitcase and isn't a complete inconvenience for you to carry, right? The best tool for the job is the one that you have with you. That's why phones are so insanely important when it comes to photo and video right now.
I think one thing I can say is we were a good match because you had me who was like, I'm ready to just click record on my voice memo and start recording these podcasts. Like I wanted to be prolific in creating content, and probably admittedly had a low bar on what the production needed to be. I didn't care a whole lot.
Yep.
You know, from a former audio engineer of like touring with a rock band, like had a high bar of production quality, and we kind of met in the middle because you're right. I needed it to be quick and fast and easy, but also you're right that you have to have a baseline. Your audio or video can't be distracting to the listener or the viewer.
Yeah. I see that as my purpose within what I do with production is that you're here to tell your story, and I'm here to make that as transparent as possible. So the energy that comes out of you is as clear as possible to the person who's receiving it on the other end. And I think like audio and video, if you can nail the quality of that as well as possible, so have someone like me train you how to record and then edit and mix your content, it's as close as you can get to being in person with someone. That's why podcasts are so important. So I think that's why it's worth investing in it. And some people won't have the budget to pay for editing or mixing, even though it is important. And there are workarounds for that too. There's still ways to get what you need just out of like the training and the gear assessment benefits of it,
Yeah. And you mentioned, I think at least for those of us in South Dakota, but probably everywhere, like thinking beyond your geography, being able to record at a decent quality remotely, like we are today,
Yep.
Just totally opens up your opportunities for who your guest can be. Right. If I want to do a podcast about leadership and I'm restricted to a studio, if with cameras in house, the amount of leaders I can get in Sioux Falls is not to the level that I would want it to be. Right. So
Yep.
I think you mentioned that too, about like being able to go be variable and like be in person, be remote. It really opens up the possibilities. And how do you, you mentioned, I think on this bullet point, you talked about like, it's a continuous process. You keep refining and tweaking. I know we've done that I think we started with like a $200 mic, and I was deciding if I had this idea for a podcast, which how many of us have had an idea for a podcast and never got past episode 4?
Yep.
But then we got to about episode, I don't know, 30. And then you're like, hey, I think we should up the microphone game. And now we got this one that we've been using for a while. So
Yep.
yeah, how do you know how many more steps there are to keep going?
Ideally, you kind of nail it the first time. With your setup, I think I recommended a piece of gear that fit with your portable lifestyle. But as you started getting more in-person guests, and we wanted you had some tough rooms too, which was really challenging. Like these kind of mics, this is called a dynamic microphone. This is important because you have to be very close to it for it to work properly, and that helps eliminate all like the noise within the room. So yeah, I think it comes down to a lot of things, but I try to recommend the right piece of gear, and I like to have an open level of communication with people, so we can keep just talking through like sounds great, but let's do a little bit something different with your room, or like trying to eliminate more background noise. And sometimes it's on your end, and sometimes it's just knowing how to help with the guest too, right? Like getting the guest in the right part of the frame when they're on camera, trying to avoid background noises, trying to advance those things by just sending them a document of like, this is what you should do. This is the type of environment you should be in. You should have a hardwired connection for your internet. You should have a microphone if possible. So like, yeah, sometimes I'll jump on the front of calls for people and talk them through that to make sure that their guests are set up properly. So then the host isn't stressing about that.
Sure.
And some people like that all the time, but some people, they just need to see that a few times to see the troubleshooting process and see what I'm going for, so they know what mark to hit each time.
So I feel like the takeaway on production, which I think is often the part that freaks people out too much. They're like, I want to start a podcast, but I don't want to spend $1,000 on equipment. You don't need to.
No.
I want to start a podcast, but I don't know audio engineering. You don't need to. Get the most out of what you have, create a nice baseline, continue to refine.
Yep.
So number 4, we talked about, this one's huge, I think, from more the marketing perspective. Be consistent with your distribution. Does your podcast come out every Thursday? The first on the 15th? Don't be the podcast that had, and I'm guilty of this now because we did 100. I took a break. It ended up being much longer than just a short break. Talk about that. Why is consistent distribution so important?
I think people need something to expect, right? Because first of all, like if you're not hitting that mark, you were every Thursday, right?
Yep.
And you got episodes to me on Wednesday.
Hey, you're outing me here.
Sorry, man.
Often on Wednesday afternoon.
Yeah. Just playing with you. Yeah, I think just making sure that people know when to show up. It just keeps marketing efforts like consistent too. I have a question for you on that though. How often do you think people should produce content? I think that can depend. But do you have like a reasoning behind like why it should be weekly, why it should be monthly? I've always been curious about that. I have a lot of clients that they seem to do it based on like what their capacity is, which I do think is like something to factor in.
Yep.
But yeah, do you have something beyond that?
Yeah, I think about this a lot. And this is something I tell my coaching clients. I mean, what I love about podcasts is if you think about it as a pyramid, a podcast can really be like an anchor piece of content. Meaning if I make this podcast once a week, the amount of content I can bring down, kind of distribute from that pyramid is almost limitless, right? Like we could put this into AI and get the transcript and write a blog post, maybe even push it further and make it into an ebook. We could cut these clips up like what we do at Duet into clips and reels and TikToks and YouTube shorts. We could take still pictures and then pull out quotes for micro content. And so, I think the answer is you should create content daily if you're trying to grow a business. But if you want to hack that, a podcast is the best way to do it because you start with the podcast and then break it down. Now, I'm also talking about a video podcast in this context. You can do a little audio clip type of little sharing things, but video is much more compelling. So if you're doing a podcast and have a video component, which we have here, it just gives you so much more options. Now, I think the perception is that podcast, again, has to be high quality production. There's a lot of value. You mentioned it earlier, grabbing your phone and just sharing a thought. I always use the line of document, don't create, right?
Yeah, I love that.
If you're sitting there as a CEO, a marketer, an entrepreneur, a solopreneur, and you're like, what do I say? What's my content strategy? I just say document, don't create. Like just walked out of a big pitch meeting. It went great. Like here are the 3 things I learned. Or, hey, it's Friday afternoon, we're headed to the lake. It's important to have work-life balance, right? Like tell people want to know who's behind that logo and like who's behind that, what's the story of that company. So just document it.
Good point. Yeah. What I'm doing at Earthtones right now for promo packages is I have shorts, mediums, and longs. You kind of have like the 30 to 90 second thing, you have the 2 to 5 minute thing, and then you have the 15 plus minute thing. Because sometimes it's nice just to see like the best chunk of the episode and know that like this 15 minutes is going to give you probably the best summary of what you could show up for if you have the hour. But if you don't have the hour, here's 15 minutes. You could talk about the podcast too. You could document about the podcast. You could give people an update. It doesn't have to only be the clips that you get out of the episode, right? It could be you talking about it and expressing that and just talking to your camera.
Yeah. And I think don't put limits on what is right or wrong for a podcast. Like do what feels right for you, right? Like we're experimenting with the Leadmore format. Maybe some of these end up being 10-minute framework episodes.
Yeah.
On the other side of the spectrum, you have former Leadmore guest David Rosenthal from Acquired Podcast, which since he's been on the show, they've just exploded. Not because of me, but they've exploded. And they go sometimes 3-4 hours on their podcast. They did 9 hours about like Berkshire Hathaway talking about the story of this company. And they're wildly popular. Or David Senra from the Founders Podcast. Like, I think people are really starting to play with the medium of podcasts. We don't have these limits of like 40-minute back and forth conversation.
Whatever tells the story, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't need to be
absolutely.
short, doesn't need to be long. It just needs to be what tells it. And if you need to fit within the constraints of 30-minute things, then you do part 1, you do part 2, whatever it needs to look like.
Yep.
But yeah, get the story right. I like that too. I was thinking about that. Like, how long should podcasts be? And I do think that's the answer.
The last piece on this, you talked about engage with your audience, asking them. The metrics is one thing. Like, do the long episodes get more listens? Do the shorter ones get more listens? Like, use the metrics, but also podcasting metrics are incomplete. So ask them, right?
Yeah.
What did you like? What was the takeaway?
Another thing that I wanted to pull out of that note that I had there is with audience engagement, I think it's also important with the show flow. Like, yeah, tell the story, have the person who you're communicating with, but also put little fun things into the show, right? Like, what did you have for a while? You had like a kind of rapid fire stuff or like just recurring questions that you're asking. I think that's really important to include within episodes from an audience perspective. It kind of breaks things up. It gives people something to look forward to each time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I call those like the parts. It's like, are there reoccurring parts or themes? Or I've heard like the idea that like when you watch an episode of Law and Order, it's been a wildly popular show forever. The parts of the show are basically the same. There's like a crime that happens, and then there's a court case, and then there's like some discussion and drama, and then we know what happened. Like there was these parts that happened the same, even though the story was different.
Yeah,
it's kind of the same show. I think parts are good because for listeners, they become familiar. That could be reoccurring characters, reoccurring little bits or segments. I think having clear parts is also important.
I always had this idea. I have this kind of masterclass video type client. They do microblading stuff. So basically like tattooed eyebrows, which is interesting. And I've gotten to really know that industry well because of that. And I always thought it'd be cool to have a podcast. It could be any business, but I thought about this for them where they're very interesting, right? They're a group of ladies who they have life experience that they're raising kids. Some are like studying, some are just kind of crushing it as like, employees for this company. I always thought it'd be interesting to have a podcast that is almost like progressively dismisses people as it goes on. So it could start with life advice stuff, and then it could go to business advice, and then it could go to like industry technique specific kind of stuff. And it kind of just funnels people out, right? Like everyone could show up for the life advice thing. A lot of people could show up for the business advice thing. Fewer people could show up for the really technical microblading technique kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that'd be cool to have a podcast that's inclusive of like every single type of person who they have, and they can still hit on the things that they're interested in. I don't know. Maybe shows are already thinking about that, but I think that'd be kind of a cool way to structure a show.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that whole point about playing with the format. Like, I think we are so early still in the game of podcasting. If anybody's listening to this, they're thinking, shoot, I should have started a podcast, but now it's too late. Like I missed my chance, which is why I'm bringing mine back because like I still want to keep going. I love doing it. It's fun, but I think we're still so early in what podcast will become.
Yeah, a lot of options.
All right. So lastly, this is a perfect one to end on. And probably ultimately the answer as to whether or not you're going to stick with it. So if we're talking about staying with it is important, make sure to have fun. So number 5 was to have fun.
Yeah, for sure. I think we kind of talked about the not getting too serious about it, just from your host perspective. So you're kind of like enjoying it. You're in the moment. From a business perspective, don't have like huge expectations for it. You know, just do your best, tell the story, show up. You're gonna grow. You're gonna grow as a business. You're gonna grow as a person. You're gonna grow within your connections. Like if you really like do a podcast right and like put the effort in, I would say you're going to grow. So like there's not really a loss. Like yeah,
Yeah.
it might cost you something, but I really do think that it's something fun to show up for that reason alone. Um and yeah, also I have another note here about find something that fits within your budget. Like right? Like do a production level that fits within your budget. If you're very low budget, I don't know. I have so many ways where you could do that on a budget. You could do it with your AirPods and you could do it through the software we're using right now. You have a lot of options. It won't sound as good, but yeah,
Sure.
do that appropriately. Do that appropriately for what your budget is as a business, what it needs to look like. But yeah, if you just want to tell your story, like there's not a huge barrier to entry if you really want to share something.
Well, I love that. I mean, we've talked about on this episode, like from a business standpoint of like, showcasing your existing clients so you get more with the event company, building trust and relationships and sort of like affinity, which First National Bank wildly successful. But then you go down to just using it as a marketing machine, like using the podcast to create all this other content, which fills your marketing calendar and your marketing funnel and your social media channels. We've talked about just expanding your network to meet really cool people, your favorite football coach or your best-selling author. And then number 5 is just like having fun with the people you want to talk to, right? Learning things. Like I think you can tell the host that are enjoying when you listen to a podcast, right? That they're learning, they're curious, their voice is, they're reacting. You can definitely tell the hosts that are having fun while they're doing it.
Yeah, I would agree. That's cool.
So if a leader was thinking, should I do a podcast or how do I do a podcast? What's your answer to them?
I think everyone who's curious about it should give it a shot. Honestly, I don't think there's a huge barrier to entry to do this. If you're less serious about it, there are really inexpensive ways to go about it. If you're a little bit more serious, I would reach out to someone like me at Earthtones because I have a big range of people who I can help with this. I can help people who just need to like DIY it and they just need the training. They need to know what gear to use. They're trying to get the most out of it on that level. But I also handle people up to uh, those who want to create an entire studio. They want to go all in.
Hmm.
They know it's the right move. They want to do it well. They want it to look as good as any of the big shows. So then we're talking about building a space out and using it for the
Cool.
podcast and other things too. So I would say that anyone interested in it should give it a shot and like dedicate time to doing at least like, what would you say? At least 10 episodes to feel it out before you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think in this start small feedback, you could commit to a season, like 8 episodes, 10
It,
episodes. Like we're
yeah.
gonna do a season. So then you're not saying like every Thursday for 100. I did that because I'm stubborn and I wanted to see if I could do 100. But you could say we're going to do 10. We're going to budget for 10. We're going to work with Earthtones. We're going to do it. And maybe sometimes I'm sure some people more prepared than me dropping them the day before might even record all 8 or 10 before they release them, right?
Yeah.
Because you do get better the more you record, undoubtedly. Like you'll look back at your early ones. I do. Episode 1 with Dennis Dugard. I had no idea how to interview anybody. So, maybe you put 8 or 10 in the can. And I also love your idea of like with the studio setup, guess what's not going away? Like Zoom calls, team meetings, virtual stuff. So do an 8 episode podcast, try it, see what works. And at the least, you've just upgraded your total, like your virtual call setup and your Zoom setup.
100%. Yeah. Well said.
All right. Well, this is fun to get a little bit more technical with you, different than last episode, but love to see you building this business. And I'm so grateful for all the help on the Leadmore podcast. Thanks for making my setup look good.
Yeah. Thanks, John.
All right. Thanks, Nate. We'll see you.
See you.
All right. That was episode 102 with Nate Poeppel on the value of creating a podcast and how to create a great podcast. Quick recap, those 5 key components that you need to think about if you're starting a podcast or already running one. Know the story you want to tell. What is the reason you're making the podcast? What's the story you want to tell? If you're the host, be prepared and be an engaged host. Show up, listen, engage, ask meaningful questions, do your research. Number 3, get the most out of your audio and video equipment. As Nate said, you don't have to have the fanciest stuff. You don't need your own studio. I'm right here in my own house. But whatever your budget level is, whatever the commitment that you want to make, get the most out of it. Use it correctly. Make sure that your audio video isn't distracting to your listener or viewer. Be consistent with your distribution. Something I was doing really well for a while when we did 52 straight episodes and 100 episodes. Then I took a break. I'm back trying to be more consistent. That's why we still drop Leadmore episodes on a Thursday, because if you're used to it, that's where they've always gone. So be consistent. Let your audience know what they can expect. And then lastly, have fun, right? I love making podcasts. Make sure it's fun. The audience can tell if you're having a good time. The guest on your show can tell if you're having a good time. So have fun, create the content, be engaging, and your listeners will enjoy it as well. So thanks, Nate, for coming on. If you want to learn more, look at earthtonespodpro.com and Google Nate and Earthtones. He can help you create your own podcast in 2024. That's all. Thanks. Take care and be well.